Hello everyone and welcome to the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm your host to this podcast, which offers a platform for lawyers to share their story and their journey into law and activism. Our guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work, as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer up advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law, or criminal justice. The Activist Lawyer podcast is brought to you by the Granite Podcast Studio. Thank you so much for listening. Now, we've got a truly powerful conversation lined up for you today with two brilliant movement lawyers, Marbré Stahly-Butts and Ameca Reali, whose work is reshaping the landscape of lawyering for social change. So in today's episodes, we get into movement lawyering, what it is, what it takes to be one, and how lawyers can really be forces for liberation. Marbré and Ameca will talk about their excellent new book, Lawyering for Liberation, a Toolbox for Movement Lawyers. I've read the book and I can't tell you enough about how much I really enjoyed it. I read it before the interview and it's such an insightful, practical guide for not only lawyers, people who are working in social justice, legal workers, and anyone who really wants to become an organiser for real and meaningful change. So together we sit down and talk about the essential skills and qualities that movement lawyers should embody. This is really important, from both the personal and professional to strategic planning. We also reflect on how movements arise, how these movement lawyer groups organise themselves within the movements, and the ways in which lawyers can sometimes feed into or even perpetuate the very systems of oppression that we aim to dismantle. That's a really interesting part of the conversation. We also touch on something important around success in the courtroom, always being the measure of a lawyer's effectiveness, and sometimes knowing when to step back from the spotlight if you are involved in maybe high profile representation of communities. It's just critical to know when to maybe step back and when to speak up. It's so interesting. So Marbré and Ameca, they are obviously two lawyers who live and breathe this work. And their commitment to clients, to communities, to the students that they work with is very, very evident. If you're a lawyer practicing human rights or public law, or just someone passionate about justice and change, you'll definitely want to check out their book. We'll be sharing links in the podcast notes. And yes, so give that a read. And as always, we'd love to hear what you think about both today's conversation. If you have any feedback on the book, please let us know and give us a review if you have the time. And please share this episode with others and let's keep the conversation going. So thank you for listening and enjoy today's episode. Hello everybody and welcome to today's episode of The Activist Lawyer. Welcome to the studio. Well, joining us here in our studio, Ameca and Marbré. It's such a pleasure to have both of you on the podcast today.
It's so nice to join you.
Yeah. No problem. So just to begin with, Ameca, maybe yourself, just to introduce yourself and maybe share a little bit about your personal journey and how you got involved in movement lawyering, which is something we're going to focus our entire conversation on today.
Yeah, thanks again for having us. And this is such a great question. We used to ask this a lot in our training. So I'm a mother, I'm a lawyer. I'm originally from upstate New York and grew up in a very kind of small-ish city just north of New York City, a few hours. And, you know, early on, my orientation to like showing up for people, showing up in community was really planted in me by my family, by the women in my family who really stepped up to do things that our government should be doing for people, feeding them, helping to clothe people, advocating for people who were being evicted. And none of these women were lawyers or professionals in this sort of work. They just did this as something that they were called to do. I originally went to law school just because I saw people being disappeared into the criminal legal system, like quite a bit. And I felt like at the time I should understand the legal system. I should know how to navigate it in order to be effective at helping people, you know, who I saw in my community and in my family being sort of snatched up into this system. And my journey to movement lawyering is just like an extension of that. So going to law school and understanding pretty quickly that the tools that they were giving us weren't necessarily going to be effective. in getting the type of change I saw was necessary. And this is just coming from like my upbringing, understanding all of those things I just talked to you about. And then really quickly, I went to law school here in New Orleans. I connected with movement groups and organizations because I felt really at home with people in movement spaces. And I learned over time how to show up as a lawyer in these spaces, like how to come correct, how to understand what my power was in the space and what we were doing collectively. So it was a lot of trial and error. And then I joined the team at Law for Black Lives in 2019, I think. And it just kind of made it official. But I was already doing a lot of what we were doing at L4BL in my life and in my work.
Sure. Brilliant. And yourself, Marbré, how did your journey evolve to where you're at today?
Yeah, I also love this question because when I think back on how I kind of became a movement lawyer, I feel like there's kind of two phases. And so from a very young age, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I, come from a family of preachers and teachers. And this idea of a calling was something that in the same way that we talked about kind of my mother and my grandmother and the women in my family did professions that they saw as more than just their jobs, but as really things that made the world better. And so, at a young age, people I loved were exposed to the criminal legal system and to policing practices that I thought were brutal. And I remember thinking when I was 11 or 12 that the only way that I could have power in these situations where I watched my loved ones be abused by these systems was to speak kind of the language of the law. And I think into law school, honestly, until I was like a 1L, I really thought that becoming a lawyer would allow me to really fundamentally change outcomes for both my immediate family, but also for the communities that I claim and come from. And so it wasn't until law school where I really realized how systemic and fundamental the flaws in this system were. And we often say, this system isn't broken. And I think, all of my life, I had this kind of sense that the system was broken and that I could help repair it if I had enough privilege or enough tools. And very quickly in law school, it became clear to me that the system was working exactly how it was supposed to, that it was swallowing and kidnapping and taking young Black and brown men, poor and working class people, that it was abusing women and femmes and trans people by the police, not as some malfunction of the system, but because this is how racial capitalism was built in this country, and the criminal legal system is a really important part of that. And so, I remember maybe it was October of my 1L year trying to calculate how much I would owe my law school if I just quit. I was just nah, this is not for me. I don't think that lawyering can solve this. And because so much of my journey to law school was based on trying to really think about how to build power and feel more powerful in these really scary experiences I had of powerlessness, I felt really disillusioned. And so I finished law school. I decided to do, criminal legal reform and policy after some internships. But I think I really, I felt pretty cynical and deeply disconnected from this sense of a calling that I'd had when I was younger. And it wasn't until Ferguson, so for folks who may not be a U.S. audience, although hopefully this is global knowledge, in 2014, we can talk about all of the killings by the hands of the police that happened before that. And there was, I think part of the reason why Ferguson erupted is because almost every community was familiar with having a loved one, a young person stolen from them by police and state violence. But Ferguson happened. There was a young man named Michael Brown who was killed by the police and then left literally like a lynching scene in the middle of his street for hours in the summer heat. And the people of Ferguson, the young people of Ferguson, the working class people of Ferguson, led by young folks, queer folks who were not part of kind of the establishment of movement, took to the streets and refused to leave the streets until there was some kind of semblance of justice. And so I was a baby lawyer. I was like a year out of law school. I was at an organization that sent me to Ferguson. And it was the first time that I felt hopeful. I had this sense that actually movements can move mountains, and that if enough people believe that they can change something and put themselves and risk something on the line, that actually what becomes possible very quickly completely changes. And so I think that experience for me solidified this idea that actually through lawyering, if that's done done in community with movement, if it's done in a way that's building power, that the things that felt like systemic inevitabilities actually were just conditions that could be changed too. And so very quickly after that, the next year, a group of movement lawyers, and I thought of movement lawyers as kind of this alien, these like people who come into communities and do something. And I think that summer I met, Vince Warren, Purvi Shah, Alana Greer, Amon Freeman, all of these incredible lawyers who had embarked on their career in a way to really build movement. And so that's kind of my journey to movement lawyering. And then I was one of the co-founders of Law for Black Lives coming out of that moment.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, of course, Ferguson and other related incidents, and obviously you go through some examples as well, and the contributors to your brand new book go through their experiences of movement lawyering and their theory behind it as well. So I've read your book, and firstly, congratulations to both of you and to everybody who contributed to it. It's really a fantastic powerful resource, I think, and it will be well utilised. But just looking at the book, which is, I love how it's described on the back as a fiery manifesto and practical guide for advancing Black liberation and transformative social change. So excellent. But maybe, Ameca, why did you feel it was important to write this book at this time? And maybe we could discuss who, in fact, the book is intended for. Who do you intend to use the book?
That's a great question. I when I was at Law for Black Lives, I served as the membership director, and Law for Black Lives had a network at the time of a little over 3,000 people across the country who had said, we're interested in supporting this work. We want to help movement. We want to support movement. Let us know how we can do that. Over time, we built that network to a little over 7,000, which is pretty incredible, and also speaks to the power of this work of showing lawyers how they can actually advance meaningful social change. And so I, as a function of my job and as of our work, we did a lot of trainings. We trained a lot of lawyers, legal workers, law students, people in institutions, seasoned lawyers who were trying to reorient to the work. And we felt like it was necessary to put this in one place. We thought that it would, one, be something really useful, but two, we couldn't find a resource out there that helped us really in one place. We did a lot of obviously studying and research to try to bring our trainings to people, and in that, we really found all of this wasn't in one place. So we put it together in one place because we thought it would be useful. And also, it's important, I think, we used to say, just to build on Marbré's earlier religious reference, that we need to swing the doors of the church open and call people in. And this is one tool that you can use to do that. Yeah. And it made it easier. We thought it would make it easier for us to sort of orient people to this work and to this practice and make it accessible. And I guess the audience, I would say, just to speak to the audience, obviously law students and people who are just coming into legal education or the law and wanting to establish themselves in the profession, this book is obviously for them. But I also think this book is for any lawyer or legal worker who is really feeling like they're pushing paper or they're not using their skills and their abilities in a way that is helpful, or who are frustrated by this moment and feel like they want to tap in and they want to help. I think this book is a great place to start.
It is a great place to start. And even just the way the book is structured, it is an actual toolbox. So you'll have guidance there, references and advice for lawyers who are interested in taking up this work. But there's also excellent contributions there. One that stood out for me was Gina Clayton-Johnson on Black feminist lessons and women who had incarcerated loved ones. And I loved how it led up to the creation of this group, the SE Justice Group. And the chapter also includes, and there's quotes throughout the book, but I love the bell hooks quote: "One of the most vital ways we sustain ourselves is by building communities of resistance, places where we know we are not alone." And I think that quote really stood out for me because it captured a lot of the essence of the book, this sense of community and lawyers not just lawyering in isolation, but really placing themselves within the community. So maybe breaking down for people who aren't familiar with this type of work at all, but are interested, what is movement lawyering exactly? And the term seems to be gaining a little bit of traction here, but how is the role different from that of traditional lawyering as we know it?
I love that you quoted Gina Clayton Johnson's piece and bell hooks. I think just to say quickly when I answer the question, one of the things that is so inspiring and exciting about this book to me is the voices of practitioners and lawyers. And one thing that I think is just true about movement lawyers is that they are in all sorts of positions. And so, Gina runs SE Justice Group, which is a group that works with, trains, and creates leaders out of women and folks who have incarcerated loved ones, and goes from a place of kind of powerlessness to power. But, that we have everything from litigators to policymakers to academics to organizers, that, a key part of movement lawyering is that you kind of can do it wherever you stand, which I think is a really powerful piece. So I'll say, there are lots of different names for movement lawyers. When I was in law school, folks called it rebellious lawyering. I think people call it community lawyering. Yes, I know. I like that one too. But there's all sorts of terms for it. And I think the key kind of piece of movement lawyering, as we call it, and we can use that term interchangeably, is this idea that you're using your legal tools as a way to try to build power for communities who have been marginalized, oppressed, or silenced by the kind of systems and the status quo that exists right now. And that means, I think it's a really important thing to say that the what of movement lawyering isn't that different. Like, as I said, movement lawyers are out here filing complaints. They're out here defending people in court. They're out here trying to lobby to push policy. They're out here writing memos and blue booking. Like, they're doing the same kinds of things, but the how and the why are really different. And the how is different because the how is in deep collaboration and community with people who are trying to make systemic change, who are trying actually to disrupt and to change the kind of distribution of power and privilege that exists. And so that means often that the work takes a bit more time. It means that the work happens in a collective and a collaborative way. It means that ultimately movement lawyers are accountable not to kind of ethical rules that the court sets up exclusively, but also to the communities that they serve. And this is especially, we'll talk about this later on, I think, complicated in the kind of client lawyer situation where people are serving kind of individual clients, because of course we have a lot of ethical rules on how we engage with clients. And part of movement lawyering is thinking about not just a single client, but communities and how we can shift power. And then the why is also really different. So, I think that often, I spent years doing policy, and there was this sense, and especially in kind of the nonprofit industrial complex, there was this sense that the why of fighting for policy was to win the policy, right? That if you were able to win the case or win the policy, then that was kind of the North Star and the victory. And so a lot of our legal training teaches us to measure our success by the metrics of the law. Did you win the case? Did you win the motion? Did you win the policy? Did you win the settlement? And inside of movement lawyering, the question isn't did you win in the legal form? It's did this build power? And sometimes actually losing builds more power than winning, right? Sometimes you file suits or you engage in policy fights that you can't win, because in doing so, you transform people's understanding of the issue, or you get discovery that shows new things, or you get more information about your opposition, right? And so I think the most important part of movement lawyering is this idea that you have to be a skilled tactician, that our movements for liberation and for justice deserve lawyers who know what they're doing, who are skilled, who are trained, who are intentional. So it's not that you're doing different things, it's that you're doing them for different reasons, and that you're measuring success in a fundamentally different way. That the question is this intervention that actually is supporting an organization or community in having more power and exercising more power, in having the space to imagine and dream and scheme about a better and different future. And so that, I think, is kind of the fundamental difference. And there's been movement lawyers since there's been lawyers. I think you can think about, Nelson Mandela was a trained lawyer, right? That throughout history, in every single struggle for freedom, for liberation, for equality, there have been people who have kind of chosen as their tools, legal tools. And so I think it is a very old orientation to how we might lawyer and how we might contribute to movement. But I do think, in the US, I think internationally, there's been, we've seen, these kind of 10 plus years of really sustained movement globally. And I think more and more people are understanding that we have to use all the tools in the toolbox, including tools that relate to the law.
Yeah, and of course, learning from other groups as we grow, which is a great starting point for anybody getting into this type of work, is to look at your book. And of course, many people are movement lawyers without even knowing it, and not even using that term, which is something that just struck me. But you do mention politics in the book as well. How important is one's political views when they start this work, or if they're already involved in this work?
I think one of the key differences between people who practice movement lawyering and traditional lawyers is that movement lawyers or people engaged in movement lawyering are constantly honing their political analysis, sharpening their understanding of power and of how power is built, where power lies, and what is at the root of the systems of oppression that you are working against, right? You have to understand that in order to be engaged in liberating people from that. And what I learned in law school is that actually you can pretend as if none of that exists and say that you are apolitical and very neutral, and that your only real goal here is to find a way to argue both sides. And I think that's a significant difference. Like there is, if you are engaged in the project of liberation with any kind of group, you have to understand what you're up against. There is no way that you can be effective in your role as a movement lawyer if you don't engage in the study of that system, where the power lies, what the advantages are. I mean, of like, what are what the opportunities are. Like, if you don't do that, then you're not being effective. And what traditional lawyering teaches us is that we can just ignore that and still be competent and effective lawyers. And I think movement lawyering as a practice, we just disagree with that as a premise and require that you sharpen your political analysis just like you do your skills.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't make sense to work so proactively within a community without having some kind of alignment to what's going on politically. It just wouldn't make sense. But also in the book, Marbré, you talk about, and you kind of touched on measuring success and the measure of success, but sometimes lawyers actually do more harm than good. And you've given some examples, and some of the contributors have throughout the book. What does this mean? And can you maybe speak of some examples where even with the best of intentions, even in a successful case, might actually do some harm inadvertently without actually realizing it?
Absolutely. And I want to tell two stories about that. I want to first, though, just to Ameca's point, because the politics is my bag. Amen what Ameca said, I think, especially this idea of rejecting neutrality. And I think it's not just that we disagree, it's that we actually think that anyone claiming to be neutral is probably perpetuating systems of inequality. And again, not because they mean to, because, they have evil in their heart, but because if you are just practicing the law inside of these systems as they stand and acting as if the results are the product of fairness or justice or like some objective outcome, then I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding the system, right? That actually these systems have been set up to maintain and protect and legitimize and naturalize power. And so if you are not asking questions about that or challenging that in some fundamental way, you are like, I think is it Charles Hamilton Houston about either you are a parasite or you're a change maker? Like if you're going to be a lawyer, you're either making change or you're continuing to be part of the problem. So I just, we often said in our trainings, you don't have to leave, we will come here and give you our best pitch on Black feminism and abolition and anti-capitalism. You don't have to believe that, but please believe something. Please know that your political beliefs are animating your work. And so be mindful, be sharpening, be cognizant of what they are. So just to like, amen. And I actually think that question is a really a good lead in to this question around like when lawyers do harm. And I think you're right. There's a small percentage of cases where lawyers do harmful things because of negligence or because, they're not being competent. But I think far and away, the most damage that lawyers do actually isn't a product of ill intentions. It's often done by lawyers who really are working really hard to do their best, either don't have the relationships to hold themselves accountable or don't have the analysis to understand the impact of their work. And so I want to give, I think, two examples of that really quickly. And the first one is one that we write about extensively in the book, which Derek Bell, who was one of the founders of critical race theory and was a litigator. I call him the great quitter because he quit every job he had in protest of the institutions he worked for, from the Justice Department to LDF to ultimately Harvard. But, he writes about Brown v. Board, which we think of as this iconic, in the United States, this is the case that rules as separate but equal, which had been a long-standing long-standing Supreme Court doctrine since Plessy v. Ferguson in the 1800s, which said that you can have different facilities, different schools for Black people and white people, or white people and everybody else, as long as they are quote-unquote equal. And of course, the great lie was that they were never equal. But in 1954, with Brown v. Board, the court decides that, in fact, that is unconstitutional, that you cannot separate the races based on race, and that you have to integrate our schools, and then in a series of other orders, all other kind of institutions and public accommodations. And Bell writes about this actually as one of the first critiques of Brown. And he says, there was this laser focus, and this is in Solving Two Masters and Interest Convergence. So there's kind of two articles about this. But he says, the LDF, which is the Legal Defense Fund who had spearheaded this litigation, really does care about Black children and integration and this idea. But this idea of integration has become the kind of center of their vision. And in doing so, they've actually undermined Black teachers who were fired in mass from public schools. They've undermined Black children who are being bused from their homes, sometimes hours, into very hostile environments where they're now being placed in disciplinary and in classes that are assuming that they're not very intelligent. They're being now segregated inside of the school. And the LDF was unwilling to actually address the kind of ways that inequality was continuing to invade the system because they were so concerned with this kind of theoretical idea of integration. And he talks about, how funding and other things might come into play to influence that. But his idea is at some point LDF stopped listening to Black communities about what they wanted. And so he cites kind of these examples in Boston, for instance, where teachers, Black parents are saying, we actually care more about the quality of education for our kids than whether or not they attend schools with white kids. We actually are more interested in ensuring that our kids have quality education. And LDF was incredibly rigid and dismissed those concerns and refused to address them. And I think this is a really good example of sometimes you have an idea of what you think will get us to equality or justice, and you develop that, and you're unwilling to actually take in new information, to learn from communities, and to adjust that. And I think that happens to all of us, that we start on a path that we think is the right path. Litigation is a long journey. And the reality is that material facts might change to actually alter our analysis. And what Bell was willing to do that his colleagues at LDF were not willing to do is to reassess actually what is my goal? Is my goal equality and fairness for Black children and for all children? If so, is this the best path? And so I think this idea of flexibility, of being willing to be in study in community with people to see actually what actually is the goal that we want together is really important. The other example that I want to give, which is one of my favorite, this comes out of a piece by Jennifer Gordon, who writes extensively about the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez. And so this movement, of course, out of California and beyond, around ensuring fair wages and fair work conditions for farm workers, many of whom were immigrants. And, there's a beautiful story about the development of the legal infrastructure inside of the United Farm Workers. And Jay Cohen was kind of the lead lawyer who took the kind of reins of that. And he was in an incredibly close relationship with United Farm Worker leadership. They had a really beautiful collaboration that led to a lot of victories. But they tell this story in the article about, Jay Cohen was like a young kind of hotshot. He had just left kind of the nonprofit to start this internal shop inside of United Farm Workers. He's really ego beaver. He's excited. There's a series of situations where they were having protesters being arrested for sound violations because they were using those kind of mega horns in trying to organize the protests in the fields. And so they were having, police were coming, brutally arresting members of United Farm Workers. They were having to go to court. But they were using this as kind of a media linchpin to say, look at how unfair we're being treated. And so Jay Cohen is super excited. He goes to court. He decides he's going to try to get an injunction to stop these arrests for these sound violations. He wins. He comes into the office of Cesar Chavez. He's like, guess what? We had this big victory. And Chavez is furious. He says, that's not what we wanted. We wanted to continue those arrests as a media point, as a talking point about how unfair we were being treated. And you've just taken away one of our major kind of points inside the media to really push our agenda. And so this idea that if you're not in profound and deep relationship, if you're not part of kind of the strategic conversations, if you don't decenter a legal win inside of those, you will advance legal wins that seem really good to kind of the ordinary lawyer, but actually aren't considering the long-term strategies and movements that you're part of. And so I think this idea around relationships, accountability, and strategic intervention is so important. And just to the last point, you can't be a helpful strategic partner if you don't have kind of a sharp political analysis. If you haven't spent time doing the study, being engaged in that study, then you're not that helpful as a strategic partner, which I think best version of movement lawyering is when we're in deep relationship and conversation with movements, and we're part of that strategizing, and we're doing that in a way that isn't centering just our expertise.
Exactly. And you do go through examples of that and maybe what not to be in terms of a lawyer, in terms of the skills that one might possess. But also the book really starts about talking about individualism and collective action and the kind of tension that exists between those. And I think that's something that you kind of hammer home at the outset, that this is about real community spirit, community organization. And the lawyer is not just someone with legal skills. They have to be an organizer or give that role to someone else and know when to kind of step back and know when to go forward with something. So you do that really, really well. And Ameca, I think leading on from Marbré's point there about the role of the lawyer, by default, lawyers are essentially part of a system that is, you know, a broader kind of supremacist and inequitable system. Is this something that you tackle? And is this something that you agree with, that we're naturally part of the system, despite the fact that we're still trying to, you know, be the voice for people who need us and represent communities? And how do you kind of navigate that? Is that something that you're looking into?
So I do want to back up a little bit to just address this like lawyer as an organizer thing, because I think it comes up quite a bit. And there's a natural thing that folks do when they're a part of systems that are oppressive, which is that we kind of want to say, no, I'm not a part of that. But if you are trained in the law and you are engaging in legal practice and you use these skills, you in some way are tied to very oppressive systems. So the goal is to understand that and be constantly evaluating how that is coming up in the way you're showing up as a lawyer or a legal advisor or a legal worker in movement spaces. Lawyers don't have to be organizers. They just have to understand power and how to shift power, which is really the practice of organizers, right? So you should understand organizing, right? I've been trained by organizers many times in many different tactics. I don't call myself an organizer. Do I understand organizing tactics and how to shift power? I do. Am I always willing to get brush up on those skills and tactics and my understanding of it? I am, because I don't practice it every day. But back to your point about being a part of this system. You know, one of the skills that you have to develop if you are practicing movement lawyering is just understanding how your privilege is showing up and is impacting the way that you maybe advise your clients, the way that you understand a situation. And then I think a real necessity for movement lawyers or folks practicing movement lawyering, as Marbré brought up just a second ago, was that you really do need relationships of accountability where people who you trust can say to you, hey, I don't like the way you're moving there. Or I think you need to reconsider because what you have proposed doesn't exactly get us to where we want to go. And we keep telling you that and you're not listening, right? Or you're not trying to come up with another approach or trying to understand our perspective and letting that inform your advice. And so to that point, I think another thing that movement lawyers need to develop is this, beyond flexibility, some creativity. There are limits to the legal education that we have been given because we have been told to see things from a neutral perspective and from either winning or not winning, right? You either get the legal victory or you don't. And so you are limited in these 3 years or so that you're going through legal education in understanding how you utilize those skills in a way that goes beyond a legal victory and gets people much closer to freedom. And so beyond flexibility, I think also creativity is essential for people practicing movement lawyering. And then one of the key things you also need to be able to do is to just unattach yourself from the allure and the power of a legal win and the establishment. It is possible to be successful and to win and to get people closer to freedom without being completely aligned with the status quo, which is what we consider the existing legal system and our laws to be. And so I think you have to really think about that, entertain it, see yourself in a way that isn't just tied to the system. And that's how you sort of detach yourself from the system that you are in and out of, you are practicing in, you know, the ways of, you're utilizing the tools and the skills of, but you are not in agreement with and fully standing in line with that system. And there's no like concrete way to measure it. You just have to constantly be engaged in the practice of understanding where you stand and your role and the impact of what you bring into movement spaces is. So that's not like a very tight or succinct answer, but I do think it's, you know, movement lawyering can be messy.
Yeah,
it's not always like, it doesn't come always in a clean, neat package.
It's not. And I mean, no, it's a great answer. You really explained the point. But I was just thinking that myself, it's tough to consider all of this. But it's important, as you said, to practice it and put yourself in that position if this is part of your work. So there's also a section in the book by Dima Khalidi. It's Lawyering in a Time of Genocide, which of course covers what's happening around the pro-Palestinian movement in the US. And indeed, we're looking at this worldwide. And it's really a powerful example of maybe how lawyers can and maybe should play a role in liberation movement. And the book talks about what's happening in terms of police brutality, protests, and so forth. And I'm also, I suppose, I'm looking at this in particular because I'm a member of the Irish Lawyers for Palestine group here in Ireland. So I have a particular interest in speaking to you about this as well. But what do you see as key lessons from this work? And how can movement lawyers around the world learn from examples? How do we share our work, especially when it requires urgent and very responsive action?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for your work too in supporting Palestinian liberation. You know, we were so grateful. It's funny you say that today because actually Dima rewrote it as the book was going through. It's been a 3-year process, and the article that she had written, which was a beautiful article, by the time we went to print, felt so out of date because of just how quickly, from the genocide on, things have been moving. But I think, and this is true for a number of the case studies, but I think the Palestinian liberation example and the work that Dima talks about, which is the work of paralegal here in the US, I think could be a case study that kind of gives us insights into lawyering and movement lawyering kind of in every area. And so, the key takeaways that I have from her piece, aside being, deeply moved by it, number one, is she begins by talking about gaslighting, which I think is a really important kind of term to think about the way in which so much of the history, and this is true, of course, for Palestinians, but also for Black folks, for every group that's experienced, I think, oppression, there's this sense that you're being told things about yourself and your community that are so untrue, but are the the backbone of the treatment you receive, these assumptions about your humanity, and so this idea that actually part of lawyering is disrupting these narratives, that part of our job as lawyers is not just to be in court or doing policy or filing things, but to think of all of these forums, the courtroom, the legislative bodies, the hearings, all of these are also places for us to truth tell. And that we are uniquely positioned because of our privilege and because of assumptions of our legitimacy as lawyers and that privilege, that we are uniquely positioned to actually tell the truth. And that is actually petrifying. And I think, the example of Palestine is a real illustration of the stakes of that I think, more than any in my, now over a decade of organizing and of legal organizing, I haven't ever seen an issue like Palestine where people lose funding and they lose jobs, right? And they get deported and imprisoned, right? That, we are in the US embarking on a new era where that seems more common. But I think in many ways, the Palestinian struggle was kind of the canary in the coal mine for that. And so I think, number one, this lesson of that, your legal skills are essential, and that a part of your work as a lawyer, whether it's on the record in a courtroom, whether it's at a congressional hearing, whether it's at the UN, whether it's at a community meeting, whether it's a press conference, is the truth tell, is to disrupt the ways in which communities that were often fighting with and on behalf of are marginalized, are dehumanized, right? That all of this truth telling can happen in all different arenas. I think the other really important lesson that Dima lifts up is this idea of solidarity, and this idea that actually, my first encounter with Palestinian liberation was late. I guess I was a baby lawyer. I was in Palestine, and I remember vividly Palestinian organizers on Twitter and on other kind of social media platforms times sharing with us like what to do with tear gas, like how to use milk, how to make sure that when the police, and of course this makes sense because the police who were tear gassing us in Ferguson were trained by, IDF officers who come to Atlanta and train them. And so like in the same way that they're international, we must also be. But I had this profound sense, and I remember the more I learned, the more I was moved that inside of their own struggle for liberation and apartheid, that they were taking the time to share advice, to build relationships, to try to bridge, right, with us in our struggle. And I think this idea, and the same must be true of this moment, that when any of us are in crisis, how do all of us show up to the best of our ability, even if we're also in crisis? And I think, we're seeing that now here in the U.S. with these ICE kidnappings. How do we think about, how do we, without underplaying our own struggle, also show up for other people in a way that actually builds our collective power? And so I think, Palestine, both the ways that Palestinians, and, Paralegal was an ally and a partner of L4BL in 2014 and beyond, because they were constantly showing up on the front lines of the Black liberation struggle. And so when they asked us to show up, it was an easy answer because of the ways that they've been in community. And so I think that is such a powerful lesson that, that we share in many ways the same enemies. They want to see all of us in some fundamental way have less power because they know if any of us have power, we'll share it. And so this idea that we have to be in solidarity. The last thing I'll say that I think Dima touches on really powerfully is this idea of strategy that, I think often we are so disconnected from each other that lawyering is often kind of pitched as this kind of solo sport, right? That you like, and that's everything from, I think, the way that one doctor did in law school, but also how confidentiality is set up, right? That you literally can't share so many things if someone's not. I think there's a real sense of isolation, and that one of the key things about the Palestinian struggle is that we have to be coordinated. That when the attack is so aggressive, when the kind of the mechanisms of the state are being weaponized in this way, we have to figure out all the different lanes, and then we have to occupy them. And so part of that is deep coordination, which requires deep relationship. And this goes to other themes in the book that you've already mentioned around, Black queer feminism and intersectionality, that at the heart of movement lawyering is this idea that we are only as strong as our relationships. And so I think this idea of connecting, of building, of being vulnerable and with each other in these moments where we're most under attack is so essential for any of us to win any kind of semblance of liberation.
Brilliant. So Marbré's touched on that, and it does come up in the book, Black feminism and queer feminism, as being central to our understanding of true liberation and social justice. Can we maybe look at the importance of both, I suppose, intersectionality in lawyering for liberation, and how the frameworks discussed help us better understand and progress the needs of the communities that we're trying to support?
Yeah, so I'll just say that at L4BL, part of what at Law for Black Lives, which is where we did a bunch of this work, central to our understanding of how to achieve Black liberation was understanding Black queer feminism and recognizing that what the Combahee River Collective many years ago posited, which is if Black women are free, then we'll all be free. But I do want to just lift up that while intersectionality and Black queer feminism are related, they're a bit distinct, right? So intersectionality, coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer, really talks about how to analyze people with multiple identities, right, that make them more susceptible to types of oppression, right? And when those are layered on, how you understand the way oppression is impacting an individual. The way I understand Black queer feminism is that it sort of takes this and other understandings built by Black queer feminist movements and it puts it into practice. It requires that we, it basically posits that we apply intersectionality and all of these learnings and practices from Black queer feminist movements over time, and we make it central to our fights for liberation, or else we will not be successful. And I think that's what makes it distinct, but also that's what made it so important to the work that we were doing at Law for Black Lives, because it was really, really a central part of how we thought Black liberation could be achieved.
Wow. And I suppose, that does stand out in the book. And obviously there's contributors for various themes, I guess. But that really struck me as being very important to remember. And it's kind of core to the essence of what all of the contributors are positing in the book. But just on that, and I'm wondering with both of you, can you draw our attention to anybody, whether it's contributors in your book or otherwise, standout movement lawyers that people listening can go and look up and find out more about their work, aside from reading about them through your pieces, or anybody that really stands out for you, whether it's in the past or somebody who's currently working in this area?
There's so many. And I have a long list in my head, but I feel like all of us have our own like star movement lawyers and just people who are in relationship with communities, people who, show up in big and small ways, whether that's like grabbing the coffee and donuts or babysitting, but also filing, like motions. And so there's a bunch. I think to start with, the list of contributors is an amazing place to start. I'm especially moved by, I think there's this work of, and Vince Warren and Povey Shaw talk about this a bit in the book of infrastructure building, that there's a really often unacknowledged, often it's not a rock star position, but it is by far, I think, some of the most difficult work, which is trying to build institutions that are responsive to the needs of our people and that outlast any moment and that allow us to, even if any given, and I think, we are right now in the United States, and I would argue globally, in this moment of intense dangerous backlash. And often the gains that we think we've consolidated disappear. I'm certainly seeing that here in the United States. And what is often left is these kind of bones of infrastructure that are like blood and tears go into building. And so when I think about the work of someone like Julie Blue Hill in Mississippi, who has built the Walker Center from literally her blood and bones, when I think about people like Amon Freeman in Baltimore, who coming out of the crisis and the uprisings after Freddie Gray has established an institution that's now lasted a dozen years, or I guess 10 years, that's doing kind of community work and is constantly, right, I think about kind of the Redwood, like has its roots in community, and so it's constantly changing its tactics and its focus in some ways to meet the community needs. When I think, of course, about people like Judith Brown-Dianis and Vince Warren, who have built and continued incredibly amazing national organizations, Povey Shaw, Christian Snow, who now runs Law for Black Lives. I really, I do, maybe because I'm an institution builder, have just a real soft spot. I think, we see amazing folks like, Chase Strangio or folks who do incredible litigation and policy work. But I actually think this work of like, and this is like the Ella Baker, right? The kind of organizer, Ella Baker, who everyone should Google if you don't know, who really was behind the scenes, but constantly trying to build structures that would outlast this moment and that would allow people not to have to start from scratch when we see these kind of mass, like when I think back on all the policy wins, all the campaigns we had that now feel so far removed from this kind of reality of just trying to survive this growing authoritarian state. What we're left with, though, is this infrastructure, these relationships that people really spend so much time building. And so I think my movement loyalty stars are the folks who have been behind the scenes doing that work.
Brilliant. And what about yourself, Ameca?
I would just say anybody in this book, any person who we invited to contribute is a rock star in my eyes. I do want to just lift up some folks who I've worked with, some folks who I know about their work. Their work is really dope. Mandisa Moore O'Neill, who lives and practices and works in the same community that I do. We have worked together many, many times. She is just really incredible. I'm always in awe of her ability to shift and change the subject matter, but always keep her values at the center of anything that she's doing. And also Tiffany Williams Roberts in Atlanta, just always there, always constant, shifting institutions, but keeping her values at the core of what she's doing. And I'm sure I mean to mention other folks, but
there's so many.
That's what comes to mind. Right now.
Well, I really enjoyed looking up some of the contributors myself and just having a look into their work. So I think it's a good opportunity in the book that you have so many put together in one space. But of course, there are others. And for anybody who's listening today that might feel encouraged by this conversation, encouraged by your book, encouraged when they look up the other movement lawyers and people that you've mentioned, what advice would you have for somebody starting off who really thinks, well, I'd like to be involved in this type of work, whether it's, with pro-Palestine, whether it's within their own community, whatever it might be? What skills might they need to have, or how would you guide them in their early career journey?
Now in my journey, I'm now teaching law students. So I'm a law professor, and it's been such a source of inspiration. I think this generation of movement lawyers are so much more politically educated and sharp than I was in my 1 hour year. So it's, honestly, it's been a glimmer of hope for me. I think I would have 3 or 2 or 3, we'll see how it goes. What is, an expression that my grandmother used to always say, which is, is you have to put your hands in the soil where you stand. And so I think this idea of wherever you are, whatever organization you work for, whatever school you attend, whatever community that you call home, it's really important to find a way to root yourself there. And that means, figuring out where other lawyers are. It means figuring out where organizers are, what they need, what they want. And often that means attending meetings and just listening and offering to get coffee for folks or put the chairs away, asking people how they're doing and how their babies and their moms are, figuring out kind of liquor people. Like all of those are things that we do to build relationships. And I really do believe that the first step in this is being rooted in something. And so, especially in this moment, I don't think any of us can do this work alone. I think we have to be part of organizations. I think the more your organization consists not just of lawyers, but also of other community people, community groups, organizers, people who live on your block, that these are really important connections. And so that's one thing, is put your hands in the soil you stand, go deep, build relationships that are not transactional, that very often we think about ourselves, especially after law school, as just a lawyer who can offer legal advice, but all of us are still clearly people who care deeply about these things. And so I think connect on that level and be in that kind of relationship. And your legal skills is a thing you can do, but it's not actually who you are. The other thing that I would say is be a skilled tactician. This is one of the things that I have to remind my law students of, is that your politics should actually motivate you to be a better student and a better lawyer, not a worse one. And I think it's hard to hold the contradiction of these tools are absolutely tools of the master's house. These legal tools were built to sustain power inequities, to naturalize, right, the oppression of Black folks, brown folks, women, name the group who's oppressed. These laws are structured to protect the powerful. And if you want to be a lawyer, you've chosen to use these tools to mitigate harm and create some space for communities to imagine something different and to build it. And so if you're not skilled at that, then find something else to do. And I think we can all be skilled at that, but it requires that you are learning, that you're engaging, that you are, even in your skepticism, are mastering it. And so I think this advice of be good at your job, take the time to both study your politics, but I think especially in law school in the first few years of practice, hone your skills. And not just the first few years. I think as your career evolves, those new skills, you need to find them and commit to them. But I think be a good lawyer and be in a relationship are kind of my two key pieces of advice. It was two.
Brilliant advice. Ameca?
Marbré, you kind of covered it. But I would just add, I think I come back to and think a lot about Miriam Kaba saying that hope is a discipline, and that it really means that you choose every day to do a little something that gets you towards the place that is hopeful, the place that is better than where you are, and that you have to have discipline and rigor in that practice. That you cannot tomorrow expect everything different because you work today. You have to commit to working every day a little bit at the thing that you're trying to achieve or at the place that you're trying to arrive. And I think sometimes it's hard to stay committed. It's hard to get up and be disciplined and be rigorous about our practice, but we need to do that. So I would just add that to everything Marbré already said.
Fantastic. Before we wrap up, where can listeners go to find out more about your work? Obviously the book as well. And what's next for the two of you in terms of the book?
UC Press is where the book's at. You can, follow Lawful Black Lives on social media and Instagram. They will be sharing out the book as well as Ameca and I both also on social media. But yeah, and it's in, I think, a few bookstores, but ask your local bookstore to order it and definitely check it out online.
Brilliant, brilliant.
I just want to say that if you're on the socials, you should follow me on Instagram at Ameca Reali. That's my first and my last name. I'm on Blue Sky, but I'm not very active. But if you're there, you can find me there too. We'll also post content on our socials about where we're showing up, where we're popping up, if we're having an event, if we're doing some teaching. So
sure,
I just wanted to plug that we're online.
Please do. And also we'll share links in our show notes as well for our listeners to this very informative, very important episode. And I want to just thank both of you. I know you're so busy, for giving up your time. I find your work truly fascinating, truly relevant, and I'm sure all of our listeners will agree. And yeah, thank you so much. Come back to us again at some point.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.